Snow hammered against the Seattle of Chicago hard enough to erase the skyline beyond the apartment windows.
60
the city looked blurred,
inside a collapsing financial empire.
Like everyone inside it was realized
trying
the
to survive
only man
another
who could
winter
save her
morning
company was the
Daniel
quiet
Brooks
employee
stood
she
in the narrow
fired
kitchen
weeks
of his
earlier.
Southside apartment,
But Daniel
staring
Brooks
at
was
the
no
coffee
ordinary
maker like it had
technician.
personally
He was the
betrayed him.
invisible architect
It
behind
sputtered once,
everything,
coughed
and while the
steam,
world chased
then
power,
died
he
completely.
walked away to care for his dying
Perfect.
father.
He
Tonight,
muttered under his breath,
one decision could destroy
"Absolutely
Wall Street
perfect
forever,
timing."
or reveal the miracle
38,
God hid
Daniel
inside
had
an
the kind of
overlooked
face
man.
life carved
Before we
instead of
begin,
shaped.
tell me where you're
Sharp
watching
jawline,
from, and
hidden
don't
beneath
forget to
uneven
like and
stubble,
subscribe, so we
tired
can reach
gray blue
1,000
eyes,
followers.
shadowed by too many sleepless
Cold
nights.
rain
Dark
pressed
brown
against
hair
the
that
glass
curled
towers of
slightly at
downtown
the ends
Seattle,
because he
while
never had
Northbridge
time to cut it
Analytics
properly
glowed like
anymore.
a ship
He was
stranded in
broad-shouldered
fog
from
and
years of
money.
warehouse labor.
Daniel
But
Brooks
exhaustion
stood
had
alone
bent
in the
him
basement
recently,
server
pulling
corridor
tension
at
tight across
6:12
his
a.m.
features.
Tightening
People
a loose
used to
coolant
describe
valve
him as
with one
intimidating
hand, while
before
holding a
they
paper
heard him
cup
speak.
of burnt coffee in the other.
Then they noticed how
the
gentle
fluorescent
he
lights
was with
above
everyone
him
except
flickered every
himself,
few seconds,
especially
throwing pale
with his
shadows
daughter.
across his face.
Dad?
At 42,
A small
Daniel
voice
had
called.
the kind of rugged appearance
Daniel
people
turned toward
noticed
the hallway,
only after looking
just
twice.
as Lily
He was
Brooks
tall,
shuffled into the kitchen,
broad-shouldered, without
wearing
trying to be
oversized
intimidating,
pink socks
with
and
dark
a yellow
hair
sweater
streaked
covered
heavily
in
with gray
tiny
near the
embroidered
temples,
stars.
and a beard trimmed
Lily was
short
8 years
but
old,
uneven, small
as
for
if
her
shaving
age,
had become
with
another
huge
unnecessary
brown eyes
task
that
in a
somehow
life
carried
full of
more
obligations.
empathy than most adults.
lines
Daniel
rested
knew.
around his eyes
Her long
permanently
dark
now,
curls were
not
tangled
from age
from
alone,
sleep,
but
and
from
she
years
clutched
of
a stuffed
exhaustion
rabbit
and
named
grief
Olive
that
against
never
her
entirely
chest,
left
so
his body.
tightly,
One
there
of
was
his
something
ears
restrained
permanently
about him,
leaned sideways.
something careful.
You're supposed to be
Like a
eating
man who had
breakfast.
once occupied
Daniel
much
said
larger
softly.
spaces in the world,
I was
and
waiting for
deliberately
you.
chosen to shrink himself.
That sentence alone
Most employees
nearly
at Northbridge
broke him.
thought he was maintenance.
He looked toward
Daniel
the clock
preferred
on
it
the
that way.
microwave.
The server
7:12
fans hummed around him
a.m.
like mechanical
His
breathing.
interview at Hawthorne
He
Dynamics
understood these
started at
machines
8
better
downtown.
than most people understood
48
themselves.
minutes away in normal
Every
weather.
vibration. Today,
Every
with
fluctuation
snow
in
falling
temperature,
sideways across
every
Chicago,
subtle shift in network
impossible.
latency
told him a story.
His phone buzzed.
7 years
Ride
earlier,
canceled.
he had designed this entire
Daniel stared
infrastructure
at the
almost
notification
alone,
for a full
sleeping
second
inside a
before
converted
laughing
office
once
under
while
his
Northbridge
breath.
struggled to
Not
survive
because
its
it was
startup
funny,
years.
because if he
Back
didn't then,
then, he might
executives
lose his
used words
mind.
like visionary
Bad news?
when they looked at him.
Lily asked carefully.
Now they barely looked
He
at him at
hated how
all.
careful she'd
His
become
phone
these past
vibrated in
2
his
years.
pocket. A
Just
text
transportation
message.
stuff,
Dad
bug.
wandered into the
He
hallway
forced a
again,
smile,
asking
nothing
for
catastrophic
Eleanor.
yet.
Daniel
She
closed
climbed
his
onto
eyes
one of the
briefly.
kitchen
stools and studied him
The
quietly
message was from
while
Hannah
Hannah
Pierce,
Pierce, the
a
rideshare
gray-haired
app
hospice
and
nurse
again,
in her 60s,
surge
who checked on his
father
father
during
during
mornings
mornings before
like an
Daniel
insult.
returned home.
Hannah was one of
$93
those
for a
rare women
20-minute
whose
ride.
kindness felt
He had
unforced.
$61
She
in
wore
his checking
oversized
account until
sweaters,
Friday.
spoke softly,
Daniel
and
pressed both
somehow
hands
never
against
made
the
Daniel
counter
feel
and
ashamed
closed
for
his
needing
eyes
help.
briefly.
His father
Divorce had
adored
not
her
ruined him all
because
at
she
once.
reminded him of
It had
school
happened
teachers from the
slowly.
1960s.
One legal payment,
though most
one
days he
missed
forgot
bill,
her name within
one
minutes.
extra shift.
Daniel
One
typed
snow
back quickly.
hammered against the streets
Tell him
of
I'll be home by
Chicago hard
7.
enough to
Did he
erase
eat breakfast?
the skyline beyond the apartment
moment
windows.
later.
The
Half
city
of it,
looked blurred,
better than yesterday.
cold and exhausted.
Daniel exhaled
like everyone
slowly.
inside it was simply
That
trying to
counted as a
survive another
victory
winter
now.
morning.
Brooks!
Daniel Brooks stood in
The
the
voice
narrow
echoed
kitchen
down
of
the
his
corridor.
Southside apartment,
Daniel
staring at the
turned.
coffee maker
Marcus
like it
Hill
had
stood near the
personally betrayed
security
him.
door, holding a
It
tablet
sputtered
against
once,
his chest.
coughed steam,
Marcus was a former
then died
Marine in his early
completely.
50s, with
Perfect.
shaved hair,
He
dark
muttered
skin,
under his breath.
and the calm posture of someone who had seen
Absolutely
enough
perfect
chaos
timing.
to stop being
At
impressed
38,
by corporate
Daniel had the
emergencies.
kind of face life carved
Unlike
instead
most
of
people
shaped.
upstairs, sharp
Marcus
jawline,
actually
hidden
saw
beneath
Daniel.
uneven stubble,
Morning?
tired gray
Daniel
blue
said.
eyes shadowed by
Marcus
too
nodded
many
toward the
sleepless
elevator.
nights. Dark
Big
brown hair
executive
that
meeting
curled
today.
slightly at the
New
end
CEO's
because he never
first
had time to cut
restructuring
it properly
announcement.
anymore. He was
Daniel
broad-shouldered
grunted
from
softly.
years of warehouse labor.
Sounds
but
exciting.
exhaustion had thinned him
Marcus
recently,
smirked.
pulling tension tight
say
across
that
his
like a man
features.
discussing dental
People
surgery.
used to describe him as intimidating
Daniel
before
almost
they heard
smiled.
him speak. The elevator
they
doors
noticed how
opened
gentle
upstairs
he
with
was with
polished
everyone
chime
except himself,
completely out of place in the basement.
especially with his daughter.
Moments later, heels
Dad?
clicked sharply across
A
marble
small voice
flooring.
called.
Claire
Daniel
Whitmore.
turned toward the hallway.
Daniel had seen
Just
her
as
exactly
Lily
twice
Brooks
before.
shuffled into the
Once
kitchen,
during a
wearing
shareholders interview on
oversized pink
CNBC
socks and a yellow
once
sweater
crossing
covered
the lobby
in surrounded by executives who moved around her like smaller planets orbiting gravity. With huge brown eyes that somehow carried more empathy than most adults. Daniel slender, with sharp long dark curls, dark blonde hair pulled into a precise knot a stuffed that never seemed affected by Seattle rain or 12-hour workdays. One of its ears permanently leaned sideways, striking. Not because they were beautiful, though they were, Daniel said because softly. They rarely softened when she looked at people. For you. Claire had built her reputation cutting inefficiencies out of failing companies with surgical precision. Toward the clock on the microwave. Investors loved her because profits followed wherever she went. His interview at Hawthorne Dynamics started at 8 downtown. Daniel watched minutes away in normal weather as she crossed the executive floor falling sideways across Chicago, still wet from rain. 2 vice presidents hurried behind her carrying tablets.
Ride canceled. 6% operational waste.
Stared at the notification while walking. Her voice was
before
calm,
laughing once under his breath.
Controlled. Not because it was
unacceptable
funny,
for a company this size.
Laugh,
Daniel returned to tightening the valve.
Bad news?
He had learned years ago
Lily
that
asked
executives
carefully.
only spoke
He
2 languages.
How careful
growth
she'd become these
and
past
blame.
2 years.
Around noon,
Just
Daniel
transportation
carried
stuff
replacement
bug.
components
He
toward the
forced
upper
a
technical
smile.
offices.
Nothing catastrophic
After a cooling
yet.
alert triggered on
She
the 8th
climbed
floor.
onto one of the kitchen stools
Unlike
and
the
studied
basement,
him quietly
these hallways
while he
smelled
refreshed the
expensive.
rideshare app again
Coffee,
and again.
polished wood,
Surge
perfume
pricing flashed across
the world
the
of
screen
people
like
who
an
never
insult.
touched the systems they depended on.
$93 for a 20-minute
As he approached
ride.
the conference
He
wing,
had
voices
$61
drifted
in his
through a
checking
partially
account
open
until
door.
Friday. Claire
Daniel
again.
pressed both hands
Daniel
against the
slowed
counter
and
instinctively.
closed his eyes briefly.
Inside the room,
Divorce
stood
had not
6
ruined
people
him all
around
at
a
once.
glowing
It
presentation
had happened
screen.
slowly.
Claire
One
remained
legal
near the head of
payment,
the table.
one missed
arms
bill,
crossed.
one extra shift.
Beside her was
Ethan
Ethan
Cole,
Cole, hammered
a
against
sharply
the
dressed
streets of
consultant
Chicago
from New
hard
York,
enough to
barely
erase the
past
skyline
30,
beyond the apartment
handsome
windows.
in the polished way
The city
magazine
looked
advertisements
blurred,
liked.
cold and exhausted.
Expensive haircut,
Like everyone
bright
inside
white
it was
smile,
simply trying to
confidence
survive another winter
untouched by
morning.
failure.
Daniel Brooks
These systems
stood in
are
the narrow
old,
kitchen of his
Ethan
Southside
said.
apartment,
Functional,
staring at the
yes,
coffee
but
maker like it had
outdated in
personally
architecture.
betrayed him.
We can rebuild the
It sputtered
framework within
once,
6 months.
coughed steam,
Claire
then died
nodded
once.
completely.
Do it.
Perfect.
A gray-haired
muttered under his
executive
breath.
hesitated.
Absolutely
There are risks
perfect
replacing
timing.
the legacy infrastructure
At 38,
that quickly.
Daniel had the kind of
Keeping
face
it
life
is a bigger
carved
risk.
instead of shaped.
Claire replied
Sharp
immediately.
jawline, hidden beneath uneven
Daniel
stubble,
felt something tighten
tired
quietly
gray
in his
blue eyes,
chest,
shadowed by
Then
2
Claire
many
said the
sleepless
sentence
nights.
that stopped
Dark
him
brown
cold.
hair that curled slightly
We
at the
cannot
ends
build
because
the
he
future
never
around
had time
people
to cut
who are
it
still
properly
emotionally
anymore.
attached
He
to
was
the
broad-shouldered
shouldered
from years of warehouse
The room
labor,
fell
but
silent.
exhaustion had thinned
Daniel
him
stood
recently,
motionless
pulling
outside the
tension
door.
tight across his
He
features.
knew she wasn't talking
People used to
specifically
describe
about
him
him.
as intimidating.
She probably
before
didn't
they
even
know
heard
his
him
name.
speak.
But somehow,
Then they noticed how
it
gentle
still
he was
landed
with
like
everyone
a blade,
except himself,
emotionally
especially with his
attached
daughter.
to the past.
Dad?
His wife Eleanor used
A
to say
small voice
Daniel
called.
collected broken things
Daniel
because he
turned
couldn't
toward the
stand
hallway.
abandonment.
Just as
Old
Lily
radios
Brooks
shuffled into the
coffee mugs
kitchen,
with chipped
wearing
handles,
oversized
worn
pink
books
socks
from
and
thrift
a yellow
stores,
sweater covered
systems
in tiny
everyone
embroidered
else wanted
stars.
replaced.
Lily was
Maybe
8
she
years
had been
old,
right.
small for her age,
Eleanor,
with huge brown
even
eyes
after
that somehow
3
carried
years,
more empathy
thinking her
than
name
most
still
adults
hollowed
Daniel
something
knew.
inside him.
Her long
He
dark
remembered
curls
hospital
were tangled
monitors
from
glowing
sleep,
blue in
and she
darkness.
clutched a stuffed
Her
rabbit
hand
named
growing
Olive against
colder
her
in
chest,
his.
so
The
tightly
promise he made
one of its
afterward
ears
while sitting
permanently
beside
beside
her
her
empty
empty
bed.
bed.
I'll
You're
take care of
supposed to
him.
be eating breakfast.
I'll slow down,
Daniel said
And
softly.
he had.
He gave
I
up
was
promotions.
waiting for you.
Stopped publishing
That sentence
papers,
alone nearly
declined
broke
leadership
him.
roles. He
Became
looked toward the
invisible
clock on the
purpose.
microwave. Because invisible
7:12
people got to
a.m.
go home on time.
His interview at Hawthorne
Daniel
Dynamics
quietly
started
walked
at
away
8
from the conference
downtown.
room before anyone
48
noticed him.
minutes away in normal
Rain
weather.
hammered harder against
Today,
the windows
with
outside.
snow falling
A
sideways
week
across
later,
Chicago,
Human Resources called him
impossible.
upstairs. The woman
His phone
delivering
buzzed.
the news was named
Ride
Sandra
canceled.
Lopez. A tired-looking
Daniel
HR
stared
manager
at the
with
notification
kind
for
brown
a full
eyes and
second
nervous hands
before laughing once
She couldn't
under
have
his
been
breath.
older than 35.
Not because it was funny.
She kept
because if he
apologizing
didn't
before
laugh,
she even
he
spoke.
might lose his mind.
Daniel, bad news?
This is
Lily asked
restructuring.
carefully.
He
She
hated
said
how
softly.
careful she'd
The
become
new
these
leadership
past 2
team is
years.
consolidating
Just
technical
transportation
operations.
stuff, bug.
Daniel
forced a
stared at
smile.
the severance
Nothing
papers
catastrophic
calmly.
yet.
4
She
weeks
climbed onto one of the
compensation,
kitchen stools
health
and
coverage
studied him
extension,
quietly while he
mandatory
refreshed
exit
the
agreement.
rideshare app again and
He
again.
nodded once. Surge pricing
When's my
flashed
last
across
day?
the screen like an insult.
Sandra swallowed.
$93 for
Friday.
a 20-minute ride.
Daniel
He
looked
had
through the glass wall
$61
behind
in his
her
checking
office.
account until
Seattle
Friday.
rain blurred
Daniel
the skyline
pressed both
into
hands
gray
against the
watercolor
counter and
streaks.
closed his eyes briefly.
For a long moment,
Divorce
he
had
said
not
nothing.
ruined him all at once.
Then
It
he
had
folded
happened
the
slowly.
papers carefully and
One legal
stood.
payment. One
Thank you
missed
for
bill.
telling me yourself.
One extra shift.
He said
One
quietly.
cup snow hammered against
Sandra
the
looked
streets of
close to
Chicago
tears.
hard enough to erase the
I'm really
skyline
sorry.
beyond the apartment windows.
Daniel gave her a
the city
tired
looked
smile
blurred,
that somehow
cold
made her
and
feel
exhausted. Like everyone
It's okay,
inside it was simply
he
trying
said.
to survive another
Companies
winter morning.
forget people. That's
Daniel
what they
Brooks
do.
stood in the narrow
Then he
kitchen of his
walked out,
Southside
carrying
apartment,
20 years
staring
of
at the
knowledge
coffee
in
maker
silence,
like it had
while the
personally
building
betrayed
hummed
him.
around him.
It sputtered
Unaware
once,
that the man who
coughed
understood
understood its heartbeat,
then died
had
completely.
just been erased.
Perfect.
Seattle's rain
He muttered
finally
under his
stopped
breath.
in early December,
Absolutely
but the cold
perfect
remained
timing.
sharp enough to make every
At 38,
breath feel unfinished.
Daniel had the kind of face
Daniel
life
Brooks sat
carved
inside
instead
a
of
dim
shaped.
coffee shop near
Sharp
Tacoma
jawline,
waterfront,
hidden
with his
beneath uneven
laptop
stubble,
open and a legal
tired,
pad
gray
covered in
blue eyes,
handwritten notes
shadowed by
beside
too
him.
many
The
sleepless
cafe
nights.
smelled faintly
Dark
of
brown
cinnamon
hair
and
that
burned
curled
espresso
slightly at the
beans.
ends because
Outside
he
the
never had
windows,
time to cut it
fairies
properly
crossed
anymore.
gray water
He
beneath
was
a sky the
broad-shouldered
color
from
of old
years of
steel.
warehouse labor.
Daniel had
but
been there since
exhaustion
7
had
in the
thinned him
morning,
recently,
applying for
pulling
jobs that
tension
no
tight
one really
across his
wanted to give him.
features.
People used to describe him as intimidating before they heard him speak. Thick brown cardigan, despite the heater running too warm inside the
everyone
cafe.
except himself.
Walter was 76,
especially with his
thin
daughter.
almost to the point of fragility,
Dad?
with pale blue eyes
small
that
voice
still
called.
looked intelligent, even
Daniel
when
turned
confusion
toward the
clouded
hallway.
them.
Just
Before
as Lily
Alzheimer's
Brooks
hollowed
shuffled
pieces out
into
of
the
him,
kitchen,
he had been a
wearing
mathematics
oversized
professor,
pink socks
known for
and a yellow
humiliating
sweater
graduate
covered in
students
tiny
without ever
embroidered
raising his
stars.
voice. Lily was 8 years old.
Some fragments
small
of that
for her
sharpness
age,
still
with
surfaced
huge
unexpectedly,
brown eyes that somehow
which
carried
somehow
more
made the
empathy
disease
than most
crueler.
adults Daniel knew.
Walter stirred
Her
cold
long,
tea
dark
slowly.
curls were tangled from sleep,
You
and she
shave?
clutched a stuffed
He
rabbit
asked
named
suddenly.
Olive against her chest
Daniel
so
blinked.
tightly one of its
This
ears
morning.
permanently leaned
Walter
sideways.
nodded
thoughtfully.
You're supposed to
Good.
be eating breakfast. Your mother
Daniel
hated
said
sloppy
softly.
men.
I was
Daniel
waiting
smiled
for you.
faintly.
That
3 minutes
sentence
later,
alone nearly
Walter asked
broke
again.
him. He
You
looked
shave?
toward the clock on the microwave.
The smile disappeared a little
7:12
slower this
a.m.
time.
His
Daniel
interview at
lowered his
Hawthorne
eyes toward
Dynamics
another
started at 8
rejection
downtown,
email glowing on his laptop
48
screen.
minutes away in normal
We
weather.
appreciate your experience.
Today, with
However,
snow falling
we have
sideways
decided to
across
pursue
Chicago,
candidates whose background
impossible.
more closely aligns with our
His
current
phone
direction.
buzzed.
Ride
Current
canceled.
direction. That
Daniel
phrase
stared
again.
at the notification
Younger,
for a full second
cheaper,
before
more
laughing once under
replaceable.
his breath.
Not
A
because
waitress
it was
approached
funny,
their table
because
carrying
if he
fresh
didn't laugh,
coffee.
he might lose
Her
his
name
mind.
tag read Naomi.
Bad news?
She looked
Lily
barely
asked
22,
carefully,
with dark curls
hated how
tied
carelessly
carelessly
into
into
a
a
bun
bun
past 2
and
years.
silver rings lining one
Just
ear.
transportation stuff,
Unlike
bug.
most people her
He
age,
forced a smile.
she never treated
Nothing
Walter with
catastrophic
impatient
yet.
pity. She climbed
Refill?
onto one of the kitchen
She
stools
asked
and
gently.
studied him quietly.
Daniel
while
nodded.
he refreshed the rideshare app again
Thanks.
and again.
Naomi
Surge
poured
pricing
coffee
flashed
carefully
across the
before
screen
lowering
like an
her voice.
insult. Your dad had a good
$93
morning
for
today.
a 20-minute
He told me
ride.
3
He had
different customers,
$61
the
in his
history of
checking
chess.
account until Friday.
Walter looked offended.
Daniel pressed
It's an
both
important
hands against
game.
the counter and
It
closed his eyes
absolutely
briefly.
is.
Divorce
Naomi
had
said
not ruined him all
seriously.
at once.
Daniel
Daniel
watched
watched
her
her
walk
walk
away
away
and felt
one
the
legal
strange
payment,
ache that
one
came
missed
from
bill,
small kindnesses.
one extra shift.
When life was
One
otherwise
cup
stripping
snow
itself
hammered
bare
against the streets of
His
Chicago
savings
hard
were
enough to
disappearing
erase the
faster
skyline
than he
beyond
admitted
the
out loud.
apartment windows.
Medication,
The city looked
blurred,
rent, home
cold,
care,
and exhausted.
insurance, like everyone
Northbridge's
inside
severance
it was simply
package
trying
had
to
looked
survive
generous
another winter
until
morning.
real life started feeding
Daniel
on
Brooks
it.
stood in the narrow
His
kitchen
phone
of
vibrated.
his Southside apartment,
Unknown
staring
number.
at the coffee maker
Daniel
like it had
almost
personally
ignored it
betrayed
before
him.
answering. It
Mr.
sputtered
Brooks,
once.
this is
coughed
Amanda
steam,
Keller from
then
Viridian
died
Financial
completely.
Technologies. Amanda's
Perfect.
voice carried
He
polished
muttered under his breath.
professionalism, sharpened by
Absolutely
long
perfect
hours in
timing.
recruitment calls.
At 38,
Daniel pictured
had
her
the
before
kind of
she even
face
introduced
life
herself
carved
instead
fully.
of shaped.
Immaculate
Sharp
posture,
jawline, hidden beneath
expensive
uneven
glasses,
stubble,
perfect
tired
scheduling
gray
habits.
blue eyes shadowed by
We
too many
reviewed your
sleepless
application
nights.
for the
Dark
infrastructure
brown hair that
consultant
curled
role.
slightly at the
She
ends
continued.
because he never
Your
had time to
technical
cut
assessments
properly
were
anymore.
extremely
He was
impressive.
broad-shouldered from
Daniel
years of
leaned
warehouse
back slightly.
labor, but exhaustion
But-
had thinned him recently,
A brief
pulling
silence.
tension tight
But
across his
some
features.
executives are
People
concerned
used to
you've been
describe
out of
him as
high-level
intimidating
systems leadership
before
for
they heard
several
him speak.
years.
Then
There
they
it
noticed
was.
how gentle he was
Daniel
with
stared
everyone
through
except
the
himself.
cafe window
at gulls
especially
fighting
with
over
his daughter.
scraps near the docks.
Dad?
I understand.
A small voice
He
called.
said quietly. Daniel turned
Amanda
toward
hesitated.
the hallway.
Just
For
as
what it's
Lily
worth,
Brooks
I
shuffled into the
personally
kitchen
argued for you.
wearing oversized
That
pink
means more
socks
than you
and a
think.
yellow sweater covered
After
in
the call
tiny
ended,
embroidered
Daniel
stars.
closed his laptop
Lily
slowly.
was 8 years old.
Walter
small
looked
for
up
her
from
age.
nowhere, with huge
They
brown
said no.
eyes that somehow carried
Daniel
more
gave a
empathy
tired
than most
half
adults
laugh.
Daniel knew.
You still read
Her
minds?
long dark curls were
You
tangled
forget I
from
taught
sleep,
probability
and she
theory for
clutched
30
a stuffed
years.
rabbit named Olive
Walter
against her
tapped
chest
the table
so
weakly.
tightly, one of its
People
ears
always say no
permanently
before
leaned
they regret it.
sideways.
You're
Daniel
supposed
looked at
to
his
be
father
eating
carefully
breakfast.
then. Daniel said
Some
softly,
days the disease stole nearly
I was
everything.
waiting for you.
Other days it left
That
behind
sentence
truths
alone
too
nearly
sharp to
broke
ignore.
him. He looked
Across
toward the
Seattle,
clock on the microwave.
Northbridge Analytics was having the
7:12
best quarter in
a.m.
company history.
His interview at
Claire
Hawthorne
Whitmore stood
Dynamics
before
started
a
at 8
wall-sized
downtown,
digital display in the
48 minutes
executive
away in
conference
normal
room,
weather.
while investors
Today,
applauded
with
projected
snow falling
earnings.
sideways
The city
across
skyline
Chicago,
glittered behind
impossible.
her through massive glass windows.
His phone buzzed.
She looked composed
Ride
as always,
canceled.
dressed in a fitted black
Daniel
suit
stared
that
at the
emphasized her
notification
narrow
for a
frame
full
and
second
rigid posture,
before laughing
but
once
exhaustion
under his
hid
breath.
beneath her appearance
Not
now.
because it was funny,
Faint shadows
because if
under
he didn't
gray
laugh,
eyes that
he
rarely
might lose his
rested.
mind.
Latency
Bad
improvements
news?
exceeded
Lily
projections.
asked carefully.
Ethan Cole
He
announced
hated how
confidently
careful
beside
she'd
her.
become these
Processing
past 2
efficiency
years.
is up
The
19%.
Just transportation stuff, Bug.
The room murmured
He forced
approvingly.
a smile. Claire
Nothing
nodded
catastrophic
once.
yet.
This was what
She
shareholders
climbed onto one of the
understood.
kitchen stools
Numbers,
and studied
growth,
him quietly,
momentum,
while he refreshed
for
the
the
rideshare
first time
app since
again
taking
and
over
again.
Northbridge.
She
Surge
felt
pricing
control
flashed
settling
across
firmly
the
into
screen like an
place.
insult.
After the meeting, Claire
$93
remained alone
for a
reviewing
20-minute
analytics,
ride,
while the
He
building
had
emptied into
$61
evening rain.
in his checking account until
She
Friday.
noticed something strange
Daniel pressed
buried
both
inside
hands
a
against the
transaction
counter and
report.
closed his
A
eyes briefly.
timestamp drift.
Divorce had
Only
not ruined him all at
1.8
once.
seconds.
It had happened
Small
slowly.
enough most people
One
would
legal
ignore it.
payment. Claire
One
pressed
missed
the
bill.
intercom.
One extra
Get Ethan
shift.
upstairs. One cut.
10 minutes
hammered
later,
against the
Ethan
streets of
entered,
Chicago
carrying a
hard enough
tablet
to
under one
erase
arm.
the skyline
He
beyond the
still wore
apartment
confidence
windows like expensive
The city
cologne.
looked blurred,
Though stress had
cold,
begun
and
tightening his
exhausted.
face lately.
Like everyone inside it
noticed
was simply
details
trying
now
to
she
survive
had
another
before.
winter morning.
The rushed shaving
Daniel
cuts
Brooks
near his
stood in the
jawline,
narrow
the
kitchen of his
tension in his
Southside
shoulders,
apartment,
staring
what
at
am
the
I
coffee
looking at?
maker like it had
She asked.
personally betrayed
Ethan
him.
scanned the report.
It sputtered once,
Minor
coughed
synchronization
steam,
lag,
then
probably
died
harmless.
completely. Probably.
Perfect.
It's a
He
complex
muttered under his
transition.
breath.
Temporary
Absolutely
instability happens.
perfect timing.
Claire leaned back
At 38,
silently.
Daniel
She
had the kind of
hated
face
vague
life
answers.
carved instead of
Downstairs
shaped.
in the engineering
Sharp
division,
jawline, hidden
another
beneath
new hire
uneven
stared
stubble,
anxiously at
tired
cascading
gray blue eyes
diagnostics
shadowed
on
by
multiple
too
monitors.
many sleepless nights.
Her name was
Dark brown
Priya
hair
Raman,
that curled
a
slightly at
systems
the ends
analyst
because he
recruited from
never had
Chicago
time to cut
3
it
months
properly
earlier.
anymore.
He was
Priya was
broad-shouldered
31,
from years of
petite,
warehouse labor,
sharp-eyed,
but
with
exhaustion
dark
had
braided
thinned him
hair,
recently,
and the restless
pulling
energy
energy
of
of
someone
someone who had
across his
spent her
features.
whole life
People
trying to
used
prove
to
she
describe him
belonged
as
in rooms
intimidating
dominated by
before
louder
they heard
men.
him speak.
She trusted data more
Then
than
they
people
noticed how
because
gentle he
data
was with
had never
everyone
mocked her
except
accent
himself,
during college interviews,
especially with
This
his daughter.
doesn't make sense,
Dad?
she muttered. A
The
small voice
synchronization
called.
drift kept appearing
Daniel
across
turned toward the
separate
hallway,
systems
simultaneously,
just as Lily Brooks
as if the
shuffled into the
architecture
kitchen,
itself was
wearing
compensating for
oversized
something
pink
invisible.
socks and a yellow
Priya
sweater
opened older
covered in
framework
tiny
locks
embroidered
dating back
stars.
nearly a decade.
Lily was 8
Then
years
she
old.
frowned, small for
The
her
system
age,
wasn't behaving
with
like
huge
ordinary
brown eyes
infrastructure.
that somehow carried
It
more
was
empathy
adapting.
than most adults.
Tiny
Daniel
corrections
knew.
appeared in
Her
patterns
long
almost
dark curls were
biological in
tangled from
nature,
sleep,
rerouting
and she
processes
clutched a
before
stuffed
instability
rabbit named
olive
Olive
against
against
her chest,
like
so
reflexes.
tightly, one of its
Like
ears
memory.
permanently leaned sideways.
Hell?
She
You're
whispered.
supposed to be eating breakfast.
She pulled up deeper code
Daniel
layers.
said softly.
Most had no author
I
names
was
attached
waiting for
anymore,
you.
but one recurring
That
signature
sentence
appeared
alone
repeatedly
nearly
in
broke
buried
him.
archives. He looked
D.
toward the clock on
Brooks.
the microwave. 7:12
Hours later,
a.m.
Ethan arrived at her
His
station
interview
carrying
at Hawthorne
coffee.
Dynamics started at
You're
8
still
downtown,
here? Priya
48
turned her
minutes
monitor
away in
toward
normal
him.
weather.
Did you
Today,
know parts of the
with
original
snow falling
architecture
sideways
rebuild
across
themselves
Chicago?
dynamically?
Impossible. Ethan frowned. His phone buzzed.
What?
Ride
The system
canceled.
predicts load imbalance before it
Daniel
happens.
stared at the
not through
notification
forecasting
for a full
models,
second
through
before
behavioral
laughing
adaptation.
once under his breath.
That's
Not because
impossible.
it was funny, because if
No.
he didn't laugh,
Priya
he might
said
lose
quietly.
his mind.
It's
Bad
brilliant.
news. Lily
For the
asked
first time
carefully.
since arriving at
He
Northbridge,
hated how careful she'd become
uncertainty
these
crossed
past 2
Ethan
years.
Cole's face.
Just transportation
Meanwhile,
stuff, bug. Rain returned to
forced a
Seattle
smile.
harder than before.
Nothing catastrophic
and
yet.
just after midnight,
She climbed
less
onto
than
one of the
12
kitchen
hours
stools
before
and
the
studied him
largest
quietly
financial trading
while he
session of the
refreshed the
year.
rideshare app
Northbridge's
again and
predictive
again.
market engine
Surge
suddenly
pricing
generated
flashed across the
numbers
screen like an
across
insult.
47
$93
investment funds for a
simultaneously.
20-minute ride.
Billions
He had
of dollars in
$61
projected
his
trades
checking
began
account until
drifting out of
Friday.
alignment.
Daniel pressed
2
both
seconds.
hands against the counter
Then
and
4.
closed his eyes briefly.
Then 11.
Divorce had not ruined
Inside
him all
the
at
server
once.
core,
It had
hidden
happened
correction
slowly.
systems strained
One legal
desperately
payment,
against
one
changes
missed bill,
they no longer
one
understood.
extra shift. And upstairs in her
snow
dark
hammered
office,
against the
Claire
streets of
Whitmore
Chicago
watched
hard
red
enough to
warning
erase
alerts
the
spread
skyline
across
beyond
her
the apartment
screens,
windows.
like blood
The
beneath
city
cracked
looked
glass.
blurred,
Cold
For the
and
first time in
exhausted.
years,
like everyone
she felt
inside it
fear.
was simply trying to
Rain
survive
returned
another
to
winter
Tacoma
morning.
after midnight.
Daniel
Soft at
Brooks
first,
stood in the
then
narrow
heavy
kitchen
enough
of his
to blur
Southside
headlights
apartment,
into trembling
staring at the
rivers of
coffee
white and
maker
gold.
like it had
Claire
personally
Whitmore
betrayed
drove
him.
herself for the first
It
time
sputtered
in
once,
years.
coughed
No assistant,
steam,
no
then
driver,
died
no
completely.
corporate car.
Just her
Perfect.
alone behind the
He
wheel
muttered
of a
under his
black
breath.
Audi moving through
Absolutely
wet streets.
perfect
While
timing.
Northbridge Analytics
At
quietly
38,
bled billions
Daniel
of
had the
dollars
kind
in
of face
synchronization
life
carved
carved
instead
instead
of
of
shaped.
shaped.
The
Sharp
windshield wipers
jawline
moved
hidden
in
beneath
sharp
uneven
mechanical
stubble,
rhythm.
tired
But they couldn't
gray
clear
blue
the
eyes
noise inside
shadowed
her
by
head.
too many sleepless
3 hours
nights.
earlier,
Dark dark brown hair that
directors
curled
had turned
slightly
from
at the ends
confident
because he
to
never had
terrified.
time to cut it properly
Investors
anymore.
were demanding
He was
explanations.
broad-shouldered from years of
International
warehouse
markets
labor,
were already
but exhaustion
detecting
had thinned him
irregularities in
recently,
Northbridge
pulling
forecasting
tension
systems.
tight across his
If
features.
Tokyo opened
People
before
used
the
to describe him as
infrastructure
intimidating
stabilized,
before
panic
they
would
heard
spread
him speak.
globally by morning.
Then they
And for
noticed
the
how
first
gentle
time in
he
her
was with
career,
everyone except
Claire
himself.
had no answer,
Her hands
especially with his
tightened around the
daughter.
steering wheel.
Dad? She hated not knowing.
A small voice called.
That hatred had shaped her
Daniel
entire
turned
life.
toward the hallway.
Just
Claire
as
grew up
Lily
in
Brooks
Connecticut,
shuffled
in a house
into the
where
kitchen,
weakness was
wearing
treated like
oversized
poor
pink
manners.
socks and a
Her
yellow
father,
sweater
Richard
covered
Whitmore,
in tiny
had been a
embroidered
corporate
stars.
attorney, famous
Lily
for
was 8 years
dismantling
old,
competitors in
small for her
courtrooms
age,
with
with
polite
huge
cruelty.
brown eyes that
He
somehow
believed
carried
emotions
more
existed
empathy than
mainly
most
to interfere
adults.
with
Daniel
performance.
knew. Claire learned early that praise only arrived after achievement, and she clutched a stuffed rabbit named Olive against her chest, top universities, one of its ears permanently leaned sideways.
Efficiency.
You're supposed to be herself into someone nobody could dismiss,
Daniel said softly.
But somewhere along the way, she stopped seeing people clearly. That sentence now
alone
the consequences of that blindness sat inside
toward the clock on the microwave.
Red warning across Northbridge Systems.
a.m.
The GPS announced
interview
at
at
Hawthorne Dynamics started at 8 downtown
near the Tacoma
48
waterfront.
minutes away
Claire
in normal
parked beside
weather.
an aging Honda
Today,
with rust beginning around the wheel wells
across Chicago.
Daniel's car.
Impossible.
The building looked tired.
His phone
Weather
buzzed.
stains marked the siding.
Ride canceled.
One stairwell light flickered
Daniel
weakly above
stared
the
at the
entrance.
notification for a full
Nothing
second
about the
before
place matched
laughing
the man
once
who had
under his
apparently
breath.
designed one of the
Not
most
because it was
advanced
funny,
predictive
because if he
financial
didn't
systems
laugh,
in the country.
he might lose his
She
mind.
sat motionless
Bad
for
news?
several seconds
Lily
before
asked
finally
carefully.
stepping into the
He
rain.
hated how careful
Third
she'd
floor,
become these past
apartment
2
3B.
years.
Just
Claire raised her
transportation
hand
stuff
and
bug.
knocked. He
For a
forced
moment,
a smile. Nothing
Nothing
happened.
catastrophic
Then
yet.
slow footsteps
She climbed
approached
onto
from
one of the
inside.
kitchen stools
The door
and
opened
studied him
halfway.
quietly while he
Daniel
refreshed
Brooks
the
stood
rideshare
there,
app
wearing a
again
dark
and
thermal
again.
shirt with the
Surge
sleeves rolled to
pricing
his
flashed
forearms.
across the
His
screen
beard
like
looked
an
rougher than
insult.
before.
$93 for
deepening the lines around his
20-minute
eyes. He looked surprised to see her,
in his
though
checking
not
account
shocked,
until Friday.
like some part of him
Daniel
had
pressed
expected
both
this
hands against
eventually.
the counter and
Behind
closed
him,
his eyes
warm
briefly.
yellow light
Divorce
spilled
had
from a
not
small
ruined him all
apartment
at once.
filled with old
It had
books and
happened
the faint
slowly.
smell of soup.
One legal payment,
found me.
one missed
Daniel
bill,
said quietly.
one extra shift.
Claire noticed
one
immediately
snow
how different
hammered
his
against
voice
the
sounded
streets
outside
of
the
Chicago
office.
hard enough to erase
Softer,
the skyline
less
beyond
guarded.
the apartment windows.
We have a
The
serious
city looked
problem.
blurred,
She
cold
replied,
and exhausted.
Daniel gave a faint,
like everyone
tired
inside
smile.
it was simply trying to
I
survive another
assumed.
winter morning.
Inside the
Daniel
apartment,
Brooks
an old
stood
man
in the
sat
narrow
in a
kitchen
recliner
of his
near a
Southside
lamp,
apartment,
reading the same
staring at the
newspaper
coffee
upside
maker
down,
like it had
Walter
personally
Brooks
betrayed
looked
him.
smaller than Claire
It
imagined,
sputtered once,
almost
coughed
delicate
steam,
beneath a wool
then
blanket
died
draped over his
completely.
knees. A black and
Perfect.
white cat
He
slept
muttered
beside
under
him,
his breath.
ancient and
Absolutely
overweight.
perfect
One
timing.
ear bent permanently
At 38,
downward from some
Daniel had the
forgotten
kind of
fight
face
years
life
ago.
carved instead
The
of
cat
shaped.
opened one eye toward
Sharp
Claire with
jawline,
visible
visible
disappointment
disappointment
stubble,
before going back to
tired
sleep.
gray blue eyes
Walter
shadowed
looked up
by
slowly.
too many sleepless nights.
Daniel?
Dark brown
Yeah,
hair
Dad.
that curled slightly at the
Who's
ends
the woman?
because he never had time
Claire
to cut it
suddenly
properly
felt
anymore.
strangely
He was
intrusive,
broad-shouldered from
standing
years
there
of
in her
warehouse labor,
expensive
but
coat and
exhaustion
polished
had thinned him
shoes.
recently.
Pulling
Daniel
tension
answered
gently.
tight across his features.
Someone from work.
People used to describe him
Walter
as
studied
intimidating
Claire
before
carefully.
they heard him speak.
Even through the haze of Alzheimer's,
Then they noticed how gentle he
intelligence
was
still
with
flickered
everyone
inside
except
his
himself,
pale eyes.
especially with his daughter.
Happy.
He
Dad?
said. Claire
A small
almost
voice
laughed
called.
from the honesty of
Daniel
it.
turned toward
Daniel
the hallway,
opened the door wider.
just as Lily Brooks
should come in
shuffled
before you
into
drown.
the kitchen,
Wearing
the apartment
oversized
was
pink
painfully
socks
modest.
and a yellow sweater
Small
covered
kitchen,
in tiny
faded
embroidered
couch.
stars. Lily
Cheap
was 8
lamps
years old,
casting
small
soft
for her
amber
age,
light across
with
walls
huge
lined with
brown eyes that
overflowing
somehow
bookshelves.
carried more
There were no
empathy
signs
than
of
most
luxury
adults
anywhere.
Daniel knew.
Just
Her long
practicality.
dark curls were
Quiet
tangled from sleep,
survival.
and she clutched a
Claire
stuffed
noticed
rabbit
framed
named Olive
photographs
against
near
her
the hallway.
chest, so
One
tightly,
showed Daniel
one of its
years
ears
younger,
permanently
beside a
leaned
woman with
sideways.
curly auburn hair
You're
and
supposed
bright
to be eating
mischievous
breakfast.
eyes.
Daniel
Eleanor.
said softly.
She recognized the name
was
from old
waiting for
employee
you.
records. Another
That
showed
sentence
Walter
alone
holding a
nearly
fishing
broke
rod
him.
beside a teenage
looked
Daniel,
toward the clock on the
smiling
microwave.
openly in a way he no longer
7:12
did.
a.m.
Claire felt something
His
uncomfortable
interview at Hawthorne
shift inside her
Dynamics
chest.
started at 8
She had
downtown.
spent years believing
48
ambition
minutes
was
away
the
in
center
normal
of every
weather.
intelligent person's
Today,
life.
with
But
snow
Daniel had
falling
walked away
sideways
from
across
power
Chicago?
voluntarily.
Tea?
Impossible, he asked.
His phone
She
buzzed.
blinked.
Ride
What?
canceled.
You're freezing.
Daniel
I'm fine.
stared at the notification
Daniel
for
shrugged
a full
slightly
second
and
before
disappeared into the
laughing
kitchen
once
anyway.
under his breath.
Claire stood awkwardly
Not because it was
while
funny,
rain rattled
because if he
against
didn't
windows.
laugh, he
Walter
might lose his
continued staring
mind.
at her.
Bad news?
You fired him,
Lily asked
he said
carefully.
suddenly.
He
Claire
hated
froze.
how careful she'd become these past 2
Walter
years.
frowned down at
Just
the upside-down
transportation stuff
newspaper.
bug. He forced
Or
a
maybe
smile.
somebody else
Nothing
did.
catastrophic yet.
He looked
She
confused
climbed
briefly.
onto one of the kitchen stools
I
and
forget
studied
things
him
now.
quietly while he refreshed
Daniel
the
returned
rideshare
carrying
app
2
again
mugs.
and again.
He handed Claire
Surge
one without
pricing
ceremony.
flashed across the screen
She
like
wrapped
an
cold
insult.
fingers around the heat
$93
instinctively.
for a 20-minute ride.
I didn't come here
He
to
had
argue.
$61 in his
She said
checking account
quietly.
until Friday.
No.
Daniel pressed both
Daniel
hands against
replied.
the counter and
You
closed
came
his
because
eyes
your
briefly.
systems are collapsing.
Divorce had not ruined him all at once.
Claire held his
it
gaze.
had happened slowly. One
You
legal
knew this would
payment,
happen.
one missed bill,
Yes.
one extra shift. soft. And you let it happen?
Hammered against the streets of Chicago
Daniel
hard
leaned
enough
against
to
the kitchen
erase
counter
the skyline beyond the apartment windows.
The city
Finally,
looked
he spoke,
blurred,
cold and exhausted.
I left documentation.
Like everyone inside it was simply
Not
trying
enough.
to survive another winter morning.
You didn't ask
Daniel
for enough.
Brooks stood in the narrow kitchen of his Southside apartment, staring at the coffee maker
Claire
like it had
stared into the
personally
steam
betrayed
rising
him.
from her tea.
It sputtered once, coughed
You
steam,
built something
then
nobody
died
else
completely.
understood.
perfect.
I built something
He
nobody
muttered
else
under his
cared
breath.
to understand.
Absolutely perfect
Daniel
timing.
corrected softly.
At 38,
There's a
Daniel
difference.
had the kind of face life carved
Silence
instead
settled
of shaped.
between them.
Sharp
The old
jawline,
cat
hidden
jumped
beneath
off Walter's
uneven
chair
stubble,
and wandered toward
tired,
Daniel,
gray blue
rubbing
eyes
lazily
shadowed
against
by
his
too many
leg.
sleepless nights.
Daniel
Dark brown hair that
absent-mindedly
curled
scratched
slightly
behind
at
its
the
bends
end
because
because
he
he
never
had time to
You
cut it properly
hired people
anymore.
who saw
He was
architecture as
broad-shouldered
numbers on a
from years
performance
of warehouse
report.
labor.
They
But
optimized
exhaustion had
systems
thinned
they
him
never
recently,
listened to,
pulling tension tight
Claire's
across
jaw
his
tightened
features.
slightly.
People used to describe him
think
as
I don't regret
intimidating
that?
before they heard him speak.
Daniel looked at her then.
Then they noticed
really
how gentle
looked.
he was with
And for
everyone
the first
except
time
himself.
all night,
Claire felt
especially with
stripped
his
of
daughter.
the authority she usually wore
Dad?
like armor.
A small
You
voice
don't regret it
called.
because of me.
Daniel turned
He
toward
said
the
quietly.
hallway, just as
You regret
Lily
it because
Brooks
now it's
shuffled
costing
into
money.
the kitchen, wearing
Claire
oversized
inhaled
pink
sharply.
socks and a yellow
That's
sweater
not fair.
covered in tiny embroidered
No.
stars.
Lily
Daniel's
was
voice
8 years
remained
old,
calm,
small
which
for her
somehow
age,
hurt worse
with
than
huge
anger.
brown eyes
You
that
didn't
somehow
fire a
carried more
person,
empathy
Claire.
than most
You
adults.
removed
Daniel
a variable
knew.
from a
Her long
spreadsheet.
dark curls were tangled
The room
from
went
sleep,
completely
and she
still.
clutched a stuffed rabbit
Outside,
named Olive against
rain
her
hammered
chest,
harder
so
against the
tightly,
building.
One of its ears
Claire suddenly
permanently leaned
realized
sideways.
she couldn't remember the last
You're
time someone had
supposed to be
spoken
eating
to her
breakfast,
without fear.
Daniel said
And
softly.
unexpectedly,
I was waiting
terrifyingly,
for you.
she felt tears
That
burning
sentence
behind her
alone
eyes.
nearly broke him.
She turned
He
away
looked toward the
immediately,
clock on the
embarrassed
microwave.
by the weakness. But the
7:12
tears came
a.m.
anyway. His
Not
interview
dramatic,
at Hawthorne
not
Dynamics
loud,
started
just
at 8
silent
downtown,
exhaustion, finally
48
breaking
minutes
through
away
years
in
of
normal
control.
weather.
Daniel stared
Today,
at her in
with
surprise.
snow falling
Claire
sideways
pressed
across
trembling
Chicago?
fingers against her forehead.
Impossible.
I built my
His
whole
phone
career
buzzed.
fixing broken
Ride
companies.
canceled, she whispered.
Daniel
And
stared at the
somewhere along
notification
the line,
for a full
I started
second
treating
before
people like
laughing
damaged
once under his
machinery.
breath.
Neither
Not
of
because
them
it was
spoke
funny,
after that.
because if
Walter
he didn't
watched
laugh,
quietly from
he
his
might
chair.
lose his mind.
Then slowly,
Bad
the old
news?
man stood.
Lily
The
asked
movement
carefully.
looked fragile enough
He
to break
hated how
him.
careful
He
she'd
walked
become
into the
these
hallway
past 2
entrance
years.
and looked at Daniel
Just
with sudden
transportation
clarity
stuff,
that
bug.
cut through the illness
He
for one
forced a
impossible
smile.
moment.
Nothing catastrophic
You built
yet.
that place. She climbed
Didn't
onto
you?
one of the kitchen
Walter
stools
asked
and studied
softly.
him quietly
Daniel
while he
froze.
refreshed
For
the
several
rideshare app
seconds, he
again
couldn't
and
breathe.
again. Because his
Surge
father
pricing
remembered,
flashed across the
not
screen like an
fully,
insult.
not clearly,
$93
but enough.
for a
Daniel
20-minute
lowered
ride.
his eyes.
He had
Then he walked toward the
$61
coat
in his
rack
checking
silently
account
and
and
picked
picked
up
up
his
his
jacket. Daniel pressed
Seattle
both hands
looked
against the counter
unreal
and
at
closed his eyes
2:47
briefly.
a.m.
Divorce had not ruined him all at once.
Rain and
It had
reflected
happened
neon,
slowly.
while Northbridge
One legal
Analytics
payment,
burned quietly
one
from
missed
the
bill,
inside.
one extra
Daniel
shift,
Brooks stepped through the
one
front
cup of
doors,
snow
carrying
hammered
nothing
against the
except
streets
his
of
old
Chicago
canvas
hard
messenger
enough to
bag
erase
and
the
a folded
skyline
rain
beyond the
jacket
apartment
darkened by
windows.
water.
The
security
security
desk
desk
fell
felt
silent
cold
the
and
moment
exhausted,
people recognized
like everyone
him.
inside it was simply
Conversation
trying to
stopped
survive another
mid-sentence.
winter morning.
Screens still
Daniel
flashed
Brooks
emergency
stood in
alerts
the narrow
across the
kitchen of
trading
his
floor
Southside
upstairs,
apartment,
casting
staring
red
at the
light
coffee
over
maker
exhausted
like it had
faces.
personally betrayed
Marcus
him.
Hill stood from
It
his chair
sputtered
immediately,
once,
coughed
relief
steam,
crossed
then
the former
died
Marine's
completely.
face so openly it almost
Perfect.
hurt to see.
He muttered under
Good
his
to
breath.
have you back, brother.
Absolutely
Marcus
perfect
said quietly.
timing.
Daniel
At
gave him a
38,
tired nod.
Daniel had the kind of
Don't say
face
that
life
too early.
carved instead of
The
shaped.
elevators opened
Sharp
before he reached
jawline,
them.
hidden beneath
Claire
uneven
Whitmore
stubble,
stood inside waiting.
tired gray
She
blue
looked
eyes,
nothing
shadowed
like
by
the
too
composed
many
executive
sleepless
from
nights.
financial magazines
Dark brown
now.
hair that curled slightly
Her
at the
blonde
ends
hair had
because
partly
he never
escaped
had
its
time to
knot.
cut it properly
Dark
anymore.
circles
He
shadowed
was
beneath her
broad-shouldered
eyes,
from
and
years
the
of warehouse
sleeves of her
labor,
white blouse
but
were rolled
exhaustion had
unevenly,
thinned him recently,
as if she had
pulling
forgotten she
tension
was
tight
doing
across
it.
his features.
Stress had stripped
People
the
used
polish
to
off
describe
her,
him as
leaving
intimidating
behind only a
before they
woman
heard him
trying
speak.
desperately not to watch an
Then they
empire
noticed how
collapse.
gentle he was
Neither
with
of them
everyone
spoke
except
during the
himself,
elevator ride.
especially
The doors
with his
opened
daughter.
onto chaos.
Dad?
The trading floor looked like
A
the
small
inside
voice
of a
called.
failing hospital.
Daniel
Phones
turned
rang
toward the hallway.
endlessly.
Just
Analysts
as Lily
shouted across
Brooks
rows
shuffled
of
into
glowing
the
monitors.
kitchen,
Wearing
coffee cups sat
oversized
abandoned
pink socks
beside
and a
trembling
yellow
hands.
sweater covered
Some
in
employees
tiny
hadn't gone
embroidered
home
stars.
in nearly 20
Lily
hours.
was 8 years old.
Fear
Small
changed
for
the
her age,
atmosphere of
with
corporate
huge
offices in
brown
strange
eyes
ways.
that somehow carried
With
a race
more empathy
status.
than most adults.
Everybody
Daniel
moved
knew.
with the same hunted
Her long
look
dark
once
curls
money
were
stopped
tangled
feeling
from
abstract.
sleep.
Daniel walked
clutched a
forward
stuffed
slowly,
rabbit named
studying olive against her chest.
The
so
system drift
tightly,
had worsened.
one of its ears
Now
permanently
entire
leaned
predictive
sideways.
chains were looping against one another.
You're supposed to be eating breakfast.
Financial models
Daniel said
contradicted
softly.
themselves in real time,
I was waiting
generating
for you.
impossible outcomes.
That sentence
One screen
alone
projected
nearly
massive
broke him.
gains, while another
looked toward the
forecast
clock on the
total
microwave.
market collapse using the
7:12
exact same
a.m.
data.
His
A young
interview at
analyst
Hawthorne
near the
Dynamics
back
started at
close
8
to
downtown.
tears. Her name
48
was Sophie
minutes
Lynn,
away in normal
26
weather.
years old,
Today,
thin and pale
with
with
snow
short
falling
black hair
sideways
tucked
across
behind
Chicago,
one ear. She had graduated
impossible.
top of her class at
His phone
Stanford
buzzed.
and joined Northbridge,
Ride
believing
canceled.
intelligence alone could control
Daniel
uncertainty.
stared at the notification
Tonight
for a
had
full
destroyed
second
that
before
belief.
laughing
Her
once
hands
under his
shook
breath.
while typing, not because it was
System
funny,
correction
because
failed
if he
again.
didn't laugh, she
He might
whispered
lose
to
his
nobody.
mind.
Daniel
Bad news?
stopped beside her
Lily
monitor.
asked carefully.
Because the
He
architecture
hated
is
how
trying to
careful
protect
she'd become
itself.
these past 2
He
years.
said calmly. Just
Sophie
transportation
looked up
stuff,
sharply.
bug. You're
forced a
Daniel
smile.
Brooks. Nothing
Not a
catastrophic
question.
yet. Daniel
She
climbed
glanced
onto
at
one
the
of the
corrupted
kitchen
graphs.
stools and studied him
Stop
quietly
forcing
while he
synchronization
refreshed
manually.
the rideshare
You're
app
making it
again
panic.
and again. She blinked.
Surge pricing flashed
Systems
across
don't
the screen
panic.
like an insult.
Daniel looked at her quietly.
$93 for a
Complex
20-minute
ones
ride.
do.
He had
Across the
$61
room,
in his
Ethan
checking
Cole
account until
hurried toward
Friday,
them.
carrying
Daniel
3
pressed
tablets
both
at
hands
once.
against the counter and
For the
closed
first
his
time
eyes
since
briefly.
Daniel met him,
Divorce
the
had
man
not
looked
ruined him all
genuinely
at once.
humbled. It had
The
happened
confidence
slowly.
was still there somewhere,
One legal
but
payment,
fractured now
one
beneath
missed bill,
exhaustion
one
and
extra
shame.
shift.
I isolated the
snow
recursive
hammered
fault
against the
loops,
streets of
Ethan
Chicago
said
hard
quickly.
enough to erase
But every
the
correction
skyline beyond
creates
the
new
apartment
divergence.
windows.
The
Daniel
city
held
looked
out his
blurred,
hand, cold
Show
and
me.
exhausted.
Ethan obeyed
like everyone
instantly.
inside it was simply
Claire
trying to
noticed
survive
that.
another winter
6
morning.
weeks ago, Ethan would have
Daniel
argued
Brooks
first.
stood in the narrow
Daniel
kitchen of his
scanned the
Southside
diagnostics
apartment,
only
staring at the
briefly
coffee
before
maker
moving toward
like
the
it had
central
personally
system
betrayed
station.
him.
Engineers
It
followed
sputtered
him
once,
automatically now,
coughed
not
steam,
because of
then
authority,
died
but because
completely.
he radiated something
Perfect.
rarer in a crisis.
He muttered under his breath. Certainty.
Absolutely.
Everybody
perfect
stop
timing.
talking.
Daniel
At 38,
said. Daniel
the
had the
room
kind
obeyed.
of face life
Even
carved
Claire.
instead of shaped.
Daniel pulled up the
sharp
thermal
jawline
prediction
hidden beneath
architecture on the
uneven
main
stubble.
display.
Layers
Tired
of
gray blue
interconnected
eyes
pathways
shadowed by
spread
too
across
many
the
sleepless
massive
nights.
screen like
Dark
living
brown
veins.
hair that curled
You
slightly at
optimized
the
for
end because
speed,
he never had
he
time
said
to cut it
evenly.
properly anymore.
But
he was
stability
broad-shouldered
was always
from
the
years
real
of warehouse
foundation.
labor.
But exhaustion
Ramen
had thinned
stepped
him
closer
recently,
beside him,
pulling tension
eyes
tight
fixed
across
on the
his
display.
features. The
People
adaptive
used to describe him as
balancing loops
intimidating
were
before
never
they heard him
backup
speak.
systems.
Daniel
Then they
finished.
noticed how
They
gentle
were
he was with
behavioral
everyone except
regulators.
himself. Several engineers
Especially with
exchanged
his daughter.
confused looks.
Daniel
Dad?
sighed softly.
A small voice
Then he
called.
picked up a marker and
Daniel
began
turned
drawing on
toward
the
the
glass
hallway,
wall beside the
just
monitors.
as Lily Brooks
not
shuffled
code,
into the kitchen,
patterns,
wearing oversized
circular
pink
pathways,
socks and a
pressure
yellow
release
sweater
timing,
covered in
delay
tiny embroidered
synchronization.
stars.
Lily
You're
was 8
treating
years
data
old,
like numbers,
small for her age,
he explained.
with huge
I built
brown
this
eyes
system
that
treating
somehow
data
carried
like
more
human
empathy
behavior.
than most adults Daniel
Nobody
knew.
spoke.
Her long
Daniel
dark
continued
curls were
drawing.
tangled from
When
sleep,
panic
and
enters
she
financial
clutched a
systems,
stuffed rabbit
people
named
react
Olive
before
against her
algorithms
chest
do.
so
So the
tightly,
infrastructure
one of its ears
compensates by
permanently
delaying
leaned
synchronization
sideways.
intentionally.
You're supposed
Tiny
to be eating
delays,
breakfast.
milliseconds.
Daniel said
Enough
softly.
to prevent chain reactions.
I was waiting for
Sophie
you.
frowned.
You
That
slowed the
sentence
system
alone
down on
nearly
purpose?
broke
him.
Yes.
He looked toward the clock on the
That's
microwave.
inefficient.
7:12
No.
a.m. Daniel said
His
quietly.
interview
at Hawthorne Dynamics
human.
started at 8 downtown.
The room fell
48
silent
minutes
again.
away in normal weather.
Claire stood near the
Today,
back watching
with
him.
snow falling
And
sideways
suddenly,
across Chicago,
she understood why Northbridge had
Impossible.
survived 10 years
His phone
without
buzzed.
catastrophic collapse.
Ride canceled.
Daniel had never designed systems
Daniel
around
stared at the
perfection.
notification
He
for a
designed
full
them around
second
human
before
failure.
laughing once
that
under his
realization
breath.
unsettled her
Not
deeply.
because it was funny.
Hours
because
passed.
if he didn't laugh,
Nobody left.
he might lose his
Rain
mind.
battered the windows.
Bad news?
While Daniel rebuilt
Lily asked
stabilization
carefully.
architecture,
He
painted
piece
how
by
careful
piece,
she'd
with
become
the
these
younger
past 2
engineers
years.
beside him. Just
But
transportation
he refused
stuff,
to simply
bug.
fix things
He
himself.
forced a smile.
Every correction
Nothing
became a
catastrophic
lesson.
yet.
Every
She
command
climbed
required
onto one of the
explanation.
kitchen stools
At
and
one
studied him
point,
quietly
Ethan reached for
while
an
he
override
refreshed
sequence
the
to
rideshare
quickly.
app again
Daniel
and
caught
again.
his wrist gently.
Surge pricing
Why are you
flashed across
rushing?
the screen like
We're
an
out of
insult.
time.
That's fear
$93
talking.
for a
Daniel
20-minute
released
ride.
him.
He had
Fear
$61
creates bad
in his checking
engineering.
account until
Ethan
Friday.
stared at him silently.
Daniel pressed both
Daniel's
hands against
voice
the counter
softened
and
slightly.
closed his eyes
You're
briefly.
smart, Ethan.
Divorce had
But
not
smart
ruined
people
him all at
become
once.
dangerous
It had
once they
happened
think
slowly.
speed matters more
One
than
legal
understanding.
payment, one
The
missed
younger
bill,
man lowered his
one
eyes.
extra shift. One
Around
cup snow
4:30
hammered
a.m.,
against the
Claire
streets of
entered the
Chicago
server room
hard enough to
carrying coffee
erase the
trays
skyline
herself
beyond the
because the
apartment
overnight
windows.
staff had
The
collapsed
city
from
looked
exhaustion.
blurred, cold,
Nobody
and
even
exhausted.
noticed at first.
Like everyone inside it
watched
was simply
Daniel
trying to
kneeling
survive
beside
another
Sophie's
winter
terminal.
morning, explaining
Daniel
synchronization
Brooks
behavior
stood in the narrow
with
kitchen of his
patient calm,
Southside apartment,
despite the pressure
staring at the
crushing
coffee
all of
maker
them.
like it had
No
personally
ego,
betrayed him.
no
It
humiliation,
sputtered once,
no
coughed
revenge,
steam,
just
then died
responsibility.
completely.
Claire suddenly realized she had
He
never
muttered
once
under his
led
breath.
people that way. Her
Absolutely
entire career had
perfect
been built
timing.
on pressure.
At 38,
performance. Daniel had the
fear
kind
of
of face
failure.
life carved instead
Daniel
of
built
shaped.
loyalty
Sharp
instead.
jawline,
At
hidden beneath
8:55
uneven
a.m.,
stubble,
5 minutes
tired
before
gray
global
blue
markets
eyes
opened,
shadowed by
the
too
system
many
still
sleepless
wasn't fully
nights.
stable.
Dark brown
A
hair that
warning
curled
alarm
slightly at the ends because he never had time to cut it properly anymore. Divergence detected. He was broad-shouldered from years of warehouse conversations, but exhaustion had thinned him recently. Claire felt cold tension tight across his features.
If we shut
People
down
used
now,
to describe him as intimidating before they
we
heard him
lose
speak.
billions immediately, but
Then
avoid
they noticed
uncontrolled
how gentle
collapse.
he was with everyone
And if we
except
stay
himself.
online,
Especially with his daughter.
Nobody answered.
Dad?
Because nobody knew.
A small voice called.
Daniel stared silently
toward
at
the hallway
architecture
just as
moving
Lily
across the
Brooks
displays.
shuffled into the kitchen,
10 years
wearing
of work.
oversized pink
10
socks
years
and a
of
yellow
invisible
sweater covered in
maintenance.
tiny
Every
embroidered
safeguard,
stars.
every behavioral
Lily was
delay,
8 years old,
every
small
hidden
for her
correction
age,
loop,
with huge
the
brown
system was
eyes
wounded,
that somehow carried
but
more
alive.
empathy than most
Claire
adults.
stepped
Daniel
beside
knew.
him quietly.
Her long dark
Can
curls
it
were
hold?
tangled from sleep.
Daniel
and
looked
she clutched a
exhausted
stuffed
suddenly,
rabbit named
bolder
Olive
than
against
before.
her chest so
Then he
tightly
said something
one of its
barely
ears
above a whisper.
permanently leaned sideways.
I don't know.
You're supposed to be
It was
eating
the
breakfast.
first uncertain thing
Daniel said
anyone
softly.
had heard from him all night.
I was waiting
The
for
countdown
you.
clock appeared across global
That
trading
sentence alone
monitors.
nearly broke
0,
him.
0.
He
colon,
looked toward the clock on the
0,
microwave.
0, colon,
7:12
30
a.m. His
Ethan
interview at
swallowed
Hawthorne
hard.
Dynamics started
Daniel.
at 8 downtown,
0,
48 minutes
colon,
away in normal
0,
weather.
0,
Today,
colon,
with snow falling
10.
sideways across Chicago,
Rain hammered against the glass
impossible.
walls.
His
0,
phone buzzed.
0, colon,
Ride canceled.
0, colon.
Daniel stared at the
0,
notification
5.
for a full second
Claire
before
closed her
laughing
eyes
once
briefly.
under his breath.
0,
Not because
0,
it was funny,
colon,
because if
0,
he didn't
0,
laugh, he might
colon,
lose his mind.
0,
Bad
3.
news? Lily
Daniel
asked carefully.
exhaled slowly.
He hated how
Then
careful
he
she'd
pressed
become these
enter.
past 2 years.
The market opened.
Just transportation
For
stuff,
one
bug.
terrible
He
second,
forced a smile.
nobody moved.
Nothing
The
catastrophic
numbers
yet.
began
She
stabilizing.
climbed onto one of the kitchen
Predictive
stools
chains
and
synchronized
studied him
cleanly.
quietly while he
Error warnings
refreshed the
vanished
rideshare
one
app
after
again
another.
and again.
Tokyo
Surge
corrected
pricing
first,
flashed
then
across
London,
the screen like an
then
insult.
New York.
$93
graph
for a
aligned
20-minute
perfectly.
ride. He had
Silence
$61
crashed
in
across
his
the
checking
trading
account
floor
until
before
Friday.
people began
Daniel
crying
pressed
openly
both
from
hands against
sheer
the
relief.
counter and closed
Sophie
his eyes
covered her mouth
briefly.
with shaking
Divorce
hands.
had not ruined
Ethan
him all
sat
at
down
once.
hard in his
It had
chair,
happened slowly,
staring at the
one
monitors
legal
like someone
payment,
surviving
one
a
missed
plane
bill,
crash.
one extra
Priya
shift,
laughed once,
one cut
and
snow
wiped tears
hammered
from her
against the
face
streets
immediately
of Chicago
afterward.
hard enough to
And
erase
Claire
the
Whitmore
skyline beyond the
finally
apartment
collapsed
windows.
into the nearest
The
chair.
city looked
because
blurred,
her legs no longer
cold, and
remembered how to hold
exhausted.
her up.
Like everyone
Daniel simply
inside it was
stood there,
simply trying to
watching the
survive another
systems
winter
breathe
morning.
again.
Daniel
Quiet.
Brooks stood in the narrow
Steady.
kitchen of his South Side
Alive.
apartment, staring at the
Spring
coffee
arrived
maker like it
slowly
had
in Seattle,
personally betrayed
like a
him.
city learning how to
It
breathe
sputtered
after
once,
surviving
coughed
underwater.
steam. By
then
April,
died
the rain
completely.
no longer felt heavy.
Perfect.
Cherry blossoms
He
returned
muttered
along
under his
downtown
breath.
sidewalks,
Absolutely
pale pink against
perfect
steel
timing.
and glass. At
While
38,
Northbridge
Daniel
Analytics
had the kind of
rebuilt
face
its
carved
reputation
instead
one
of shaped.
careful month at a time.
Sharp jawline,
Investors
hidden
stopped
beneath
panicking.
uneven stubble,
Clients renewed
tired
contracts.
gray blue eyes,
Financial
shadowed
media
by
moved
too
on
many
to newer
sleepless
disasters
nights.
because
Dark
markets
brown hair
rarely
that
stayed
curled
sentimental
slightly at
for
the
long.
ends because
But
he
inside
never had time to cut
Northbridge,
it properly
something
anymore.
fundamental had
He was
changed.
broad-shouldered
People
from
spoke
years of
softer
warehouse
now.
labor.
Engineers
Exhaustion had
double-checked
thinned him
decisions
recently,
together instead
pulling
of
tension
competing
tight
to look
across his
smartest in the
features.
room.
People
Junior
used to
analysts
describe
were
him as
suddenly allowed
intimidating
to ask
before they
questions
heard
without
him
being
speak.
humiliated for not
Then
already
they noticed
knowing
how
answers.
gentle he was with
Even the
everyone
trading floor
except himself
itself
felt different,
especially
less like
with
a
his
battlefield
daughter.
and more like a place
Dad?
built by human beings.
A small voice
At
called.
8 a.m., Daniel
On the
turned toward
first
the hallway.
Monday of April,
just
Claire
as Lily
Whitmore
Brooks
stood alone
shuffled into
inside
the
the kitchen,
executive
wearing
conference room,
oversized
preparing
pink
for
socks
the largest
and a yellow
shareholder
sweater
meeting
meeting
of her
tiny
career.
embroidered stars.
The sunrise behind
Lily
her
was
painted
8 years
the
old,
skyline gold,
small for her age.
She barely noticed.
With huge brown
Claire
eyes
studied
that
her
somehow
reflection
carried more
faintly
empathy
mirrored
than
in the
most
glass wall.
adults Daniel knew.
She still looked polished
Her long
from the
dark
outside.
curls were tangled
Dark
from
navy
sleep,
suit
and she
silver
clutched
watch,
a stuffed rabbit
posture
named Olive
perfectly
against
straight.
her chest.
But
So
the woman
tightly,
underneath
one
had
of its
become
ears
harder to
permanently
recognize
leaned
lately.
sideways.
Something in her had
You're supposed
softened
to be
after
eating
that night.
breakfast.
Not
Daniel
weakness,
said softly.
not uncertainty.
I was waiting
perspective.
for you.
Her assistant
That
knocked
sentence
carefully
alone
before
nearly
entering.
broke him.
Melissa Grant was
He
in her
looked
early
toward
40s,
the clock on the microwave.
elegant in a quiet,
7:12
understated way,
a.m.
with auburn
His
hair
interview
cut
at
just
Hawthorne
above the
Dynamics
shoulders
started at
and
8
reading
downtown.
glasses she constantly
48
forgot
minutes
on top
away
of her head.
in normal weather.
Melissa had worked
Today,
beside 4
with
snow falling
CEOs
sideways
over
across
15
Chicago
years.
and survived
Impossible.
by mastering invisibility.
His phone buzzed.
She anticipated
Ride
moods
canceled.
before conversations began.
Daniel
and knew
stared at the
which executives
notification
for a
screamed
full
at
second
staff
when
before
doors
laughing
laughing once under his breath.
Claire had once
Not
frightened
because
her.
it was funny.
Now
because
Melissa
if
looked
he didn't
mostly
laugh,
worried.
he might
The
lose
board
his
is
mind.
expecting layoffs.
Bad news? She said
Lily
gently.
asked carefully.
Claire kept
He
reading her
hated
notes.
how careful she'd
I know.
become these past
They're
2
preparing
years.
statements for media
Just
response
transportation
already.
stuff,
bug. Cancel them.
He forced a smile.
Melissa blinked.
Nothing catastrophic yet.
All of them? She climbed
Yes.
onto one of the kitchen stools and
For a
studied
moment,
him
Melissa
quietly,
simply
stared.
While he refreshed the rideshare app again and again.
Crossed her face.
Surge pricing flashed
Downstairs,
across the screen like
Daniel
an
Brooks
insult.
sat in the cafeteria,
$93 for a
terrible
20-minute ride
while repairing
He
an
had
ancient
$61
espresso machine
in his
nobody
checking
else
account
bothered
until
fixing.
Friday.
He wore
Daniel
rolled
pressed
sleeves
both hands
and an
against the
old
counter
charcoal
and
Henley
closed
shirt
his eyes
that still
briefly.
smelled faintly of
Divorce
machine
had
oil.
not ruined him all
The
at
younger
once.
employees
It
no
had
longer
happened
ignored him
slowly.
when he walked through
One
the building.
legal payment,
Some
one
nodded
missed bill,
respectfully.
one extra
Others
shift,
outright stared.
one cut.
Snow
Daniel
hammered
hated
against
that
the
part.
streets of Chicago
Beside
hard enough
him,
to erase
Priya
the
Raman
skyline
leaned
beyond
against
the
the
apartment
counter,
windows.
holding a folder
The
packed
city
with
looked
infrastructure
blurred,
redesign
cold,
proposals.
and exhausted.
You know, they think
like
you're some
everyone
kind of
inside
legend
it was
now,
simply trying to
she
survive
said.
another winter morning.
Daniel groaned
Daniel
softly.
Brooks stood in the narrow kitchen
That's
of his
deeply
south side
depressing.
apartment,
Priya
staring at the
laughed for the
coffee
first
maker
time
like
in
it had
weeks.
personally
You
betrayed
realize
him.
people are
It
quoting you in
sputtered
engineering
once,
meetings,
coughed steam,
That's even
then
worse.
died completely.
She watched him tighten a loose
Perfect.
valve on the machine.
He muttered under his breath.
You really aren't coming back
Absolutely
permanently?
perfect timing.
Daniel wiped his hands
At
slowly
38,
with a towel
Daniel
before
had the kind
answering.
of face life
I spent
carved
too
instead
many
of
years
shaped.
building systems
Sharp
nobody
jawline,
understood,
hidden beneath
because
uneven
nobody
stubble,
stopped long enough to
tired
learn.
gray blue eyes,
He
shadowed
glanced
by
toward
too
the
many
crowded
sleepless
cafeteria.
nights.
Dark
I don't
brown
want to
hair
spend
that
the rest
curled
of my life
slightly at the
repeating that
ends because
mistake.
he never had time
Priya
to cut it
studied him
properly
quietly.
anymore. He was
Daniel had
broad-shouldered
changed
from
since
years
the
of
collapse
warehouse
too.
labor, but
Not
exhaustion
dramatically.
had thinned him
He
recently,
still carried
pulling
exhaustion
tension
in his
tight across
shoulders
his
and
features.
grief somewhere behind
People
his eyes.
used to describe
but he
him
no
as
longer seemed
intimidating
hidden
before
inside
they heard him
himself the way he
speak.
had before.
Then they
As if
noticed how
surviving
gentle
the
he was with
destruction of
everyone
Northbridge
except himself,
forced him back into visibility
especially with
whether
his
he
daughter.
wanted it or not.
You'd
Dad,
make a good teacher,
a small voice
Priya
called.
said finally. Daniel turned toward
Daniel
the hallway,
looked strangely
just
uncomfortable
as Lily
hearing
Brooks
that.
shuffled into the
At
kitchen,
10 a.m.,
wearing
shareholders
oversized
filled the
pink
main
socks
auditorium,
and a yellow sweater
expecting
covered
blood.
in tiny embroidered
Financial
stars.
reporters lined the
Lily
walls.
was 8 years old.
Board members
small for
whispered
her
among
age,
themselves,
with huge
Claire
brown
stepped
eyes
onto
that
the
somehow
stage,
carried more
alone.
empathy than most
No
adults.
presentation
Daniel knew.
graphics,
Her
no
long
public
dark
relations
curls were
team,
tangled from
just
sleep,
silence.
and she clutched a stuffed
Richard
rabbit
Halpern
named
sat
Oliver
near the
against
front
her
row,
chest, with his
so
hands
tightly,
folded tightly
one of its
together.
ears permanently
He was
leaned
Northbridge's
sideways.
oldest board member.
You're supposed to
70
be
years
eating
old,
breakfast.
silver-haired
Daniel
and
said
severe,
softly.
famous for
I was waiting for
dismantling
you.
struggling companies before
That
they threatened
sentence alone
profits.
nearly broke
Richard
him.
believed mercy
He
was
looked toward
expensive.
the clock on the microwave.
Years earlier, his
7:12
own son lost
a.m.
everything in a failed
His
startup,
interview at
which only
Hawthorne
hardened
Dynamics
him
started
further.
at 8 downtown.
Failure embarrassed him
48
more than
minutes
it
away
saddened
in
him.
normal weather.
He expected
Today,
Claire to start
with
firing
snow
people
falling
within
sideways
minutes
across Chicago?
Instead, she walked to the
Impossible.
podium and said calmly,
His phone buzzed.
Northbridge nearly
Ride
collapsed
canceled.
because leadership confused
Daniel
intelligence
stared at the
with arrogance
notification
for a full second
room
before
froze.
laughing once under his
Claire
breath.
continued.
Not because it was funny.
1 month ago,
because if
this
he didn't
company
laugh,
removed
he
the
might lose
very
his
person
mind.
responsible for
Bad
building
news?
the infrastructure
Lily asked
that protected
carefully.
us for almost
He
a
hated how
decade.
careful she'd
Her
become
eyes
these past
moved
2
across
years.
stunned executives.
Just transportation
Not because
stuff
he lacked
lacked value.
He forced
because
a smile.
leadership
Nothing
stopped seeing
catastrophic
people
yet.
beneath job
She
titles.
climbed onto one of the kitchen
Murmurs
stools
spread
and studied him
instantly.
quietly.
Claire
while he
didn't
refreshed
stop.
the rideshare
Daniel
app
Brooks
again
designed
and again.
the adaptive
Surge
architecture
pricing
that
flashed
saved
across
this
the
company
screen
during
like
the
an
market
insult.
failure last month.
$93
And my
for a
administration
20-minute
ignored both
ride.
the complexity
He had
of his work
$61
and the
in his
humanity
checking
of the
account
man
until
who created
Friday.
it.
Daniel pressed
Near the
both
back of the
hands
room,
against the counter
Daniel
and
closed
closed
his eyes
eyes
briefly.
briefly.
He
Divorce
hated
had
public
not ruined
attention
him
with
all at
almost
once.
physical
It had
discomfort.
happened slowly. Richard
One legal
Halpern
payment,
leaned forward
one
sharply.
missed bill,
Claire,
one extra shift.
What exactly is
One
the point
cut-
of this?
Claire met his gaze without fear.
The point is accountability.
Then she did something nobody expected.
Snow hammered
She
against the
accepted
streets of Chicago
responsibility
hard enough to
publicly,
erase the
not
skyline
partial
beyond the apartment
responsibility.
windows.
All
The
of
city
it.
looked blurred,
The room
cold, and
became
exhausted,
deathly quiet,
like
as
everyone
Claire
inside
detailed
it was
every
simply trying to
executive
survive another
decision
winter
that led to
morning.
the collapse.
Daniel
No
Brooks
excuses,
stood in the
no
narrow
corporate
kitchen
language,
of his Southside
no
apartment,
scapegoats.
staring at the
When
coffee
she
maker
finally
like it had
finished,
personally
even the
betrayed
reporters
him.
had stopped
It
typing.
sputtered once,
Claire turned
coughed
slightly toward
steam,
Daniel, then died
Mr.
completely.
Brooks.
She said formally.
Perfect.
Northbridge
He muttered under his
Analytics would
breath.
like to offer you
Absolutely
the position of
perfect
Chief
timing.
Technology Officer.
At 38,
Daniel
every
had the
head
kind of
turned.
face life
Daniel
carved
stood
instead of
slowly.
shaped. Sharp
The silence
jawline
stretched
hidden beneath
long enough
uneven
to become
stubble,
uncomfortable.
tired gray
Then he
blue
smiled
eyes
faintly.
shadowed by too many sleepless nights.
A
Dark
visible
brown hair
shock
that curled
moved across
slightly
the
at
room.
the ends because
Claire
he
herself
never had
looked
time to cut it
surprised,
properly
despite
anymore.
probably
He was
expecting it.
broad-shouldered from
Daniel
years of
stepped
warehouse
forward
labor,
calmly.
but exhaustion
I
had thinned
appreciate
him
the offer.
recently,
Truly.
pulling tension tight
His
across
voice
his
remained
features.
steady.
People
But
used
I don't
to
want to
describe him
build
as
systems
intimidating
people depend
before
on
they heard him
anymore.
speak. confusion
Then they
flickered
noticed
through
how
the
gentle
audience.
he was with
Daniel
everyone
continued,
except himself.
"I want to build people
especially with his
instead."
daughter.
3 months later,
Dad?
an old warehouse
A
near
small voice
Tacoma
called.
waterfront reopened
Daniel
under a new
turned
name,
toward the hallway.
the Brooks
Just as
Institute
Lily
for
Brooks
Ethical Systems
shuffled into the
Engineering.
kitchen.
wearing oversized pink socks and a yellow sweater covered in
shipping
tiny
yard days.
embroidered stars.
But sunlight now
Lily was
poured
8
through
years
renovated
old,
windows
small
across
for her
classrooms,
age,
filled with
huge
whiteboards
brown
and
eyes
dismantled
that somehow
servers.
carried more
Young
empathy
engineers
than
from
most
across
adults.
Washington
Daniel
knew.
attended workshops
Her
there,
long, dark
learning
curls were
architecture,
tangled from
adaptive
sleep,
systems,
and she clutched a
ethical
stuffed
infrastructure
rabbit named
design,
Olive against
and most
her chest,
importantly,
so tightly,
responsibility.
one of its ears
not
permanently
profit.
leaned sideways.
Responsibility.
You're
On
supposed
the
to be
entrance
eating
wall,
breakfast.
Daniel had insisted
Daniel
on
said
hanging
softly,
a simple sentence in black
"I was
lettering.
waiting for you."
Understanding means
That
nothing
sentence
without
alone
kindness.
nearly broke him.
The institute nearly
He looked
failed
toward the
before
clock on the
opening,
microwave.
until Claire Whitmore
7:12
personally
a.m.
funded the entire
His
startup
interview at
cost
Hawthorne
without
Dynamics
announcing
started
it
at
publicly.
8 downtown.
On a cool
48
spring evening
minutes
6
away in
months
normal
later,
weather.
Claire attended
Today,
the graduation
with
ceremony
snow
for the
falling
institute's
sideways
first
across
class.
Chicago.
Students
Impossible.
laughed outside beneath hanging lights,
phone
while
buzzed.
music drifted softly
Ride
through open
canceled.
windows.
Daniel
Inside the
stared at the
hallway,
notification
Daniel stood
for a
beside an
full
old
second
coffee machine
before laughing
with a
once under
screwdriver
his
between
breath.
his teeth, not
While
because it was
trying to
funny,
repair it.
because if he didn't laugh,
Claire
leaned
he
against
might
the
lose his
doorway
mind.
watching him. Bad news? You're still fixing broken
Lily asked
machines.
carefully,
She said.
He hated how
Daniel
careful she'd
glanced
become
up,
these past
amused.
2 years.
This one's
Just
honest about being
transportation
broken.
stuff, bug.
She
He
laughed
forced a
quietly.
smile.
Nothing
For a
catastrophic
moment,
yet.
neither spoke.
She climbed onto
Then
one
Claire
of the
asked
kitchen stools
softly,
and studied him quietly.
"You never
while he
wanted to come
refreshed
back
the
and run
rideshare
something
app
enormous
again
again?"
and again. Daniel looked
Surge
through the
pricing
glass
flashed
toward
across
students
the
stepping
screen
into
like
the
an
world,
insult,
carrying notebooks and
$93
for a
impossible hopes.
20-minute ride.
His expression
he had
softened.
$61 in
"I
his
already
checking
am."
account until Friday.
Outside,
Daniel
the
pressed
graduates
both hands
disappeared
against
into
the
the
counter
spring
and
night,
closed his
carrying
eyes
the
briefly.
one lesson
Divorce
Northbridge
had
had
not
nearly
ruined him all at
destroyed
once
before
It had
finally
happened
understanding.
slowly. One
Knowledge
legal payment,
without kindness,
one missed bill,
eventually
one extra
becomes
shift.
ruin.
One cut.
Snow
Sometimes
hammered against
God
the
doesn't
streets
send
of
miracles
Chicago
the way
hard
we
enough
expect.
to erase the skyline
Sometimes
beyond the
he
apartment
sends
windows.
quiet people the world
The
ignores
city looked blurred
until the
cold
moment
and
they're needed
exhausted.
most.
Like everyone
In
inside it
everyday
was simply
life,
trying to
never
survive another
underestimate
winter morning.
kindness, patience,
Daniel
or
Brooks
the people
stood in the
standing
narrow
silently
kitchen of his
beside you.
Southside apartment,
If this
staring
story
at the
touched your
coffee
heart,
maker
please
like it had
like,
personally
share, and
betrayed
leave a
him.
comment below.
It sputtered
Subscribe
once,
for more emotional
coughed
stories,
steam,
and may
then
God
died
bless you
completely.
and your family
Perfect.
with peace,
He
strength,
muttered under his
and
breath.
hope.